In every age, God raises people up to speak the truth to the world in a way that is currently relevant. Though our opinions should not be held with the same esteem as the biblical canon, we still carry the hope of Christ to the world. Our society has forgotten what it means to follow Christ. The bright lights of truth seekers are barely visible in the dim twilight of a post-Judeo-Christian society. We all see the darkness coming. All we can hope is to share the light that He has entrusted to us. This is Modern Apocrypha. Hey, I'm Jared.
And I'm Greg.
And this is Modern Apocrypha.
Welcome, everyone.
So.
Absolutely. Good evening. Good afternoon. It is, getting on to be close to 8 o'clock here in our area. So it's a late afternoon talk.
Yeah.
So
I know this one's kind of on me. I had said, let's talk about evil. Let's talk about how people decide what evil is. And there are two different main points to hit, and then going off on kind of a related trail later. But the first point is, evil is, you can look at it from all sorts of different angles, but it's sort of like darkness and light, evil and good. Light is something. Light is the existence of something, where darkness is just the absence of something. Good is the existence of something, where evil is its absence. So when we look at things that are evil, it's because God isn't in it that it's evil. It isn't because it does a specific thing wrong, or because it goes a specific bad place, though a lot of times evil does do that. Instead, it's because God's not there that it's evil. I take it that's a simple enough approach. You agree?
It certainly is a fine enough approach. It's going to bring up the immediate question of how do you know if God is in a thing, but it is a fine enough definition.
I like the question.
Also, it speaks to the idea that evil is benign. It doesn't do new things. So good had to have done it once for evil to have picked it up.
Or it has to be a degeneration, a defilement of something good, a damaged version of something good. And because the way I see it, at least, and we've talked about this before, good is sort of infinite in its variety, that the more...
I wouldn't even limit it so shallowly as to say that it is less than, because you could take something like the Titans, or the idea that we'd spoken before of everyone loves ice cream, but not at 50 miles an hour. Everyone likes a pat on the back, but nobody likes a pat on the back every second for the rest of their life, right? So too much of a thing can degrade something just as much as less of a thing, right? So I would be careful.
Okay, so you could say that, but the point is that there is always something good at the basis of every evil thing, and that the evil thing is some sort of degeneration of the good thing. How's that?
I would say degeneration, or expounding upon something so much so that it's
still a degeneration. It's a use of something in a way that is damaging.
I just feel like the word degeneration, the idea of getting smaller, is moving away from where God put it, either too much of or
that's what degeneration means. Moving away from what it's supposed to be.
Even if it's going to more of or less than.
Yeah.
I see.
Degeneration just means turning into something it is not supposed to be, usually by degrees. So the way we judge that,
Here's an interesting visual that might help people think about that. If you've got a satellite in orbit, if it goes too fast or too slow, then it degenerates and flies away or falls down,
sure, that's fine.
right? So it degenerates by going faster or slower. That's true.
Sure, sure. Now,
Okay. Okay.
getting it to go faster could be problematic because you have to add energy, but the point is still that it changes it from its intended purpose to something else more or less than its intended purpose that is. And really you could go with other metrics than more and less. More and less is kind of a simple way to look at it. There are other perspectives that you could get at it from that would also, where you could also say that it degenerates, but it's always when it changes from its intended purpose into something else that it degenerates. It gets more or less than. It changes from that. That's a degeneration. And a lot of times, and I'm going to speak to something that isn't as much pop culture as it is Christian culture here. Most of the time when I encounter Christians making judgments about whether something is good or evil, it's about whether it follows the commands of Scripture or not, whether it conforms to scriptural principles or not. And the way I would look at this is, if you're doing something, if you set out to do something, you should intend for the thing you're doing to conform to scriptural principles. That's good, because it helps to guide you in the direction that you need to go. But when you're judging whether or not something is appropriate, it's really easy to get lost in the weeds when you're asking about whether it conforms to scriptural principles, because it doesn't. It's easy to twist those things in the details to the point where you're arguing about minutia, when you should be able to take a single look at something and gather relatively quickly whether it's good or not, whether it's. And this is where we get to how Christ told us to make judgments. He said, "You will know them by their fruit." You remember the story of the fig tree?
I think we read that out in one of our previous podcasts. The fruits of their labors.
No.
The
This is a
no,
different
is
one.
it another parable? Okay.
Jesus is walking with his disciples. This isn't a story he tells. He's walking with his disciples and he finds a fig tree and there's no fruit on it. And he says, "Be you cursed." And it withers up and instantly, and his disciples are marveling, how did it wither so fast? And Jesus says, he uses it as a teaching moment. He says, "By their fruit you'll know them. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit." So that's a pretty definitive statement from Jesus. He says a good tree can't bear bad fruit, and a bad tree can't bear good fruit. And so when we look at most of the things around us in our lives, most of the institutions, whether it's a church or a government or a school or what have you, and we ask, is it bearing good fruit or is it bearing bad fruit? We can know whether it's a good or a bad tree simply by seeing the kind of fruit it produces. And it's the same with most things in our lives. If they're producing good fruit in us, then they're a good thing. And if they're producing bad fruit, then they're not a good thing. And, you know, since I have started doing this writing, it pulls me in to God and makes me more dependent on Him and makes me more reliant on Him every single day. If I'm going to write, I have to trust Him. I have to appeal to Him. I have to listen to Him. I have to conform closely to whatever the Holy Spirit's telling me in order to be effective about writing that day. Because otherwise, what I get down on the page seems to miss the mark. No surprise there. But the point is, when something bears good fruit in your life, that's an indication that it's a good thing. When it bears bad fruit, that's an indication that it's a bad thing.
I feel like that is a wonderful place to start. I would worry, just because I do always sort of try to make sure that I'm right, to double check my work if I'm looking at things. And I would just, this goes for those people that have accepted Christ into their life, right? You got to get to that point first. You can't be crazy and get there.
Well, and the bottom line is there are two varieties of people, really. The one variety have closed themselves to God's message and they have set themselves against it. And for those people, it's really hard to help them. God can, but that's a hard thing. Then there are the people who are open to God's message. And for those people, a lot of times it takes a lot less to get them there, but one way or another, people have to come to a place where they need him and they want him and they accept him. And that's sort of, I'm trying to think how to put this. The way we were created originally, the way Adam and Eve were made, they were made so that things were good. And
As stated.
well, and they could grow in any number of directions and their growth would be good. There wouldn't be missing of the mark. There wouldn't be sin involved. They could grow into a million different complexities and differences and whatever, and it wouldn't affect their whether it was good or not. But after sin entered the picture, we get to this place where we're not capable of any good thing of ourselves. We rely on God for that. We have to be acting in his will. We have to be following his lead in order to be able to do good things. And so all of humanity lives in this sort of twilight right now where there's no, I'm not even sure how to put it into words. It's like there's no way they can do anything right because however good or right it is, it's still going to cause harm some way or other unless God's hand is on it. And that's so what you're saying is right, but it's because you've got a binary solution set in one sense. Either you're going up toward God or you're going down away from God. And as you've experienced in your life for many years, you don't have to know that you're moving toward God in order to be moving toward God necessarily, but you do have to move toward him. And unless you are, there's nothing good there. There's no positive in it. So I don't know how else to speak to that. I have to assume that anybody who's hearing this knows Christ, because if they don't, they need to desperately, whether they know it or not.
I would certainly pray and be so thankful if we brought anyone to Christ. I would never turn anyone away if they were listening and they weren't there yet. Please come.
Well, and find a way to get a hold of me. Jared at e6universe.com is an email address. You can get me right there. You can find me at Modern Apocrypha on Twitter. I'm not one of those anonymous folks who's hiding his identity. You can find me, and I will pray with you, and I will happily share with you whatever I can to help you. But the fact is, until people find Christ, they're going in a circle, and it's a vicious cycle, and there's not much that can be done about that, except Christ.
You certainly got to find your individual relationship. Otherwise, you are playing to one side of the chessboard or another. I mean, there's powers that are pushing, the slogans that are being thrown, the organizations in motion. Gosh, what is that? What is that scripture that says you don't stop right at what I told you to do, or you don't just prune the branch I told you to prune. You take too much. You don't do what I told you to do specifically.
I don't know which one you're speaking of, but I know that there's a scripture that I'm not able to call to mind right off the top of my head that talks about each of us having to work out our salvation on our own in fear and trembling before God. That it's a very individual thing, and that each of us has that relationship with Him that we have to cultivate in order to be.
Well, sure, and it just flows through the way that you handle your reality and your world. If you hear from a place um, of subservience, we both have worked in a warehouse, and you hear a plan is coming across for the building, depending on whether or not you're at the lowest level, a mid-level manager, a safety officer, a mechanic. Each person is going to look at that plan in an individual manner. That plan doesn't mean each person is going to have the same task or change with that plan implementation. And people get into these mass hysterias where they say, "Here's the plan. That's where we're going," and they don't look at their place for that plan at all, right? They
Sure.
somehow they've got themselves separated out from a real world task they're assigned to do, and thinking of something separate as if there's something separate. There's nothing separate. And your spiritual life and your everyday life, they're one and the same, and they flow together. And you've got your job in the pattern, in the kaleidoscope of
Yeah.
activity. And if you're not listening for what you're supposed to be doing in your spot, you're doing the wrong thing.
Well, and there's also that scripture that says, not to complicate this, but there's also that scripture that says He causes all things to work together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. So what that means is, if you're operating in His will, if you're in the place where He wants you to be, you kind of can't mess up. Even if you're doing the wrong thing, He'll make it come right for you. But that's if your heart is to be where He wants you to be and you're working to do that, then he'll take you where you need to go. You don't have to worry that you're missing it somehow. That's one that I've had reinforced to me recently.
Have you?
Yeah, I have.
I would say I would say also that if you are steadily working, even Job, if you're steadily working towards his goals, you'll find that it's the right place to be. Right? Whether that is
Well,
your
and
group.
he will, and if you're in the wrong place, he'll show you the right way to go. He'll show you the right place. I don't know. Any further thoughts here?
Well, just in our topic for the for the moment, the topic for the video, um, how do you, I guess, uh, categorize your level of personal involvement versus group involvement? How do you decide whether it's a church or it's a mega church? Right? We've been both to places that were large gatherings and wonderfully filled with the Holy Spirit, and seen large gatherings where no, there's nothing there.
Okay,
There's
so
nothing there.
again, this is where I would say that in any circumstance you're in, when it comes to something that exists, that's there, you can judge it by its fruit. By You will know them by their fruit. A good tree can't bear bad fruit, and a bad tree can't bear good fruit. And so when you look at the lives of the people who are affected by the thing, and are their lives being affected in a positive way? Are they being affected in a negative way? What's the and So from there, you can look at things like, and this is where, there are innumerable people who will probably be angry with me for calling out a specific doctrine or a specific religion. But frankly, I have no problem calling out all religions because if it has a name attached to it, so there's a place where Paul's writing, I think it is, and he says, "Do not say I am of Paul or I am of Apollos, because if you say those things, you're putting an emphasis in a place that's going to cause you harm." So when we talk about I'm Catholic, I'm Baptist, I'm Orthodox, I'm this, I'm that, when you identify yourself with a denomination, you're probably putting yourself into a grouping that has gone wrong in some sense. And
It's funny,
that's
you say that, and I would say that I've been through a number of organizations, and most of my associates don't say I am XYZ. They say we are attending this style of association. Right? The
well
way
and
they refer to it is that they are attending,
and
not that
that's
they are
because
that thing. That's
that's
interesting that you
because
say
there's
that.
this
Because
internalized, well, that's partly because there's this internalized thing of don't say I am of Paul or I'm of Apollos. In a lot of denominations, there are people who've actually seen that, and so they go, okay, we have to follow this rule. We can't say I am Baptist or I am Pentecostal because it puts them in those categories. When the reality is, they end up being in those categories whether they like it or not. And unless you intentionally take a step back and you look at whatever category you most closely associate yourself with, and you take a look at its fruit, you're not going to see it very clearly. So for example, most of my parents' family, both mom and dad, came from Catholic families, and a large number of my relatives are Catholic. So
a
I
large number of my
have,
friends and family as well.
huh?
A large number of my friends and family as well. Some of the
Well,
closest people to me are Catholic.
and what I would say is, what that gives me is it gives me a huge amount of perspective on the lives of people around me who are Catholic, because I've seen my whole life what it brings in their lives. And I would say that my observation would be that there are Catholics who are Christians, but to be Catholic does not make you Christian. And in fact, I think it's rarer to know Christ and be a Catholic than it is to not know Christ and be a Catholic. And that those I know who attend Catholic church or are Catholic, would say I am Catholic,
I,
have a
my
much,
opinion on this is very broad in the same way that it's terrible to sloganize. Once you've got that Catholic word on it, everyone attending a Catholic school, going to a Catholic organization, there's a lot of Catholic uh, lumping in. How in the world could a 3-year-old be anything, right? A 3-year-old is a 3-year-old, and yet they're counted as Catholic, and so you do get that combination of both inputs and outputs. You're calling somebody something that is not true, and so
yeah.
by definition, once you've got a grouping like that, it's very hard in my definition of wording to say that you're not lying about someone because you're lumping them into things that they don't even know that they're lumped into. Right? You've gone so broad as to not even be able to hold inside yourself all of the things associated to that word.
Yeah, and there's some value in what you're saying there, but by the same token, when people claim that as part of their identity, they open themselves up to certain things that are a part of it that aren't healthy too. So where I was going with that was that I see the Catholic Church as being a bad tree. It bears bad fruit. There are good people who are in it. I know a number of them and I'm related to them. And I'm saying that because I don't want people to think that I hate all Catholics or something. It couldn't be further from the truth. I love there are a lot of relatives I have who would call themselves Catholic, who I love them dearly, and they have a relationship with the Lord. And that's great, but I would say it's despite being Catholic, not because of being Catholic, that they have this relationship. And a lot of times with aunts and uncles who clung to that, their kids grew up to go some pretty messed up directions where a lot of the aunts and uncles I have who did not claim Catholicism, who instead claimed something else, their kids ended up not going such messed up directions. So you'll know them by their fruit. The Catholic Church is a bad tree, it bears bad fruit, and it is not a good thing for people to be involved in. And we can, I can get into doctrine with them to a degree, but I don't like doing it because you end up getting tied up in the minutia and you miss the bigger point, which is a bad tree doesn't bear good fruit. A good tree doesn't bear bad fruit. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Um, I certainly. It's hard to distinguish whether or not Catholicism as a church or as a thought process, however you would define it, is putting out uh, good fruit or not, because they would hold within them Christians that would put out good fruit even from within that space. So that's a little bit difficult to discern. Um, are we at a point where we should put a quick pin in it for our break spot?
We
I
could do
wanted to.
that. We could do that. And then when we get back, I want to jump the shark.
Well, there's the one thing I wanted to touch base on another stretch of this conversation is what are fruits and what are not, right? Um, we
Well, let's go ahead
in
and
it.
hit that real quick. We're still only like 25 minutes in, so
Okay, so what strikes me is that specifically financial gains would likely not be considered a fruit. They're neither. They're not considered.
mm, it depends on what sense you mean it in. If you're talking about is the business that I am working for, or the project that I am working on, viable or not, one of the fruits that you could look to would be financial. So in some context it could be, and I think in any context there's
I think
something that you
that
could look at.
I think that that's irrelevant. We've had this discussion before, where the Bible is most likely the most purchased book, and a vast number of people will buy it just to have it on the shelf. It becomes more of a peer pressure item where people need to have it, even though it's never opened. Whereas what you're aiming for is a maximal number of young people reading the stories. You want the words to be read. You do not care as much about the money being made. Your fruits will be people that are associated to and fond of the literature, right?
Right, right, but by the same token, if if I have a garbage collection business and I'm going and hauling trash cans 10 miles each direction by hand on foot every day, and I'm not making a lot of money doing it, that should be an indicator to me that maybe there's a better way to approach this problem. I
But
don't
the same
see.
person in that job, making very little money, but staying fit his whole life and attracting a spouse that finds that attractive in him, and they produce many children and they feed all of those children, and they all find happiness with no money doing that same task in that same way. The money is irrelevant.
Right, I understand what you're saying, but my point is that
What
in
are
any,
fruits?
and you're trying to insist that you can't use certain things as fruits. And what I'm saying is that depending on the context in which you're looking at things, anything can be a fruit. If your intent is to make money to support your family, then there are things that are more effective and things that are less effective. If you have other intents there, if you have other purposes there, then you have to balance those things, and there will be fruits of those things as well. It's like this whole writing this book thing that I've done. There is a possibility or probability that it will make significant money sometime down the road, but as of today, it hasn't made a whole lot of money. Does that mean it's not valid? Well, if what I was looking for were purely to make money right now, I would not be doing this. I would be doing something else.
But at the same time, if you were writing terrible paragraphs, if words were not put together well, then even over the long term, you would not pick up customer base. You wouldn't have readership.
It's true, and you know, if 10 years from now I'm not making any money from this, then I'm going to consider that to be a pretty good indicator that my time is being wasted and I should be spending it somewhere else because it isn't doing what it needs to be doing. And probably before that, I will run out of the ability to keep doing it. So the point is anything can be the fruit of something in the proper context. It's just a question of what it is you're asking.
Hmm. I would try to find some concrete uh, fruits. I would say that healthy, physically and mentally healthy children. I would say new
Greg?
knowledge, whether that's
Greg, hold up. Fruits of what? Fruits for what? If you ask the question, good, if you just say good fruits, then that could mean anything depending on what your aim is. If your aim is to say, if you what you're saying is I want to live a fulfilled life, what are the good fruits that describe that? Then you have a useful enough category that you can start asking that question. But just saying good fruits is too big a category.
interesting. I would say that there are disqualifications for those things that we have tropes about, that money doesn't uh, buy happiness, things like that. Um, you could do things that provide you a huge number of children, but you stole 100 kids from the neighboring village and they're coming to kill you, right? So, right, well, how does the story end? Might be another way to look at that, right? Doing things that provide you a full picture to a positive end.
Right, and in the long run that is what you're looking for, but we're just human, man. We have to take a slice of things as best we can and go, okay, is this bearing good fruit in my life? Is this leading to positive outcomes compared to people who are doing the same or have the same goal but are doing it a different way? And if it does lead to good outcomes compared to people who have the same goal and are doing it a different way, so let me just use this writing as an example. If I'm making enough money to take care of my family, I have enough time to write, but I'm also doing, other things like this podcast and maybe speaking to, at this or that occasion, whatever, that's great. That shows that I have a balanced life and I have enough. Maybe there are people who are writing a book a month, 50,000 words a month, and they're putting that out there and they're making 10 times the money I am. Okay, fine, you know, but they don't have these other things in their life that give them a full life because that's all they have time for is this writing that they're doing. Well, that suggests to me that there's a problem, right?
Sure, sure. And
So,
certainly, if it was the difference of somebody that hated every minute of it, right? They were sort of were miserable doing that task,
mhm.
but they were making plenty of money at that task. It's probably a going to destroy they're going to be the fig tree that shrivels, right? They're first personally going to shrivel in that space,
Yeah,
but also um, generally it has been that those rushed out works, those unloved works, end up feeling very generic. They don't have staying power.
you're right. That's true. And I'm not arguing with you, but if their goal is just to make money and that's what they know how to do, then I suppose that's what they're ending up with. But to me, for the fruit that I'm looking for, it doesn't fit, right?
It's correct. It's correct. I
Everything we
suppose.
do, everything we do in life is with a purpose, and that purpose should be the fruit that we're aiming for. So if something is accomplishing its purpose, if it is giving good fruit, then that's great. And if it's not, well, then something needs to change. And so when we're talking about bringing this back to churches, when we're talking about the church, if if it gives you a relationship with God that leads you to all of the fruits of the spirit and to and it leads you to a life where your children are faithful and all of the outworkings, because when we're talking about Christianity, it means that the lives of the people who are involved tend to have good fruit. They tend to be bearing fruit. That's what discipleship does. That's why we talk about the fruit of the Spirit. And the fruit of the Spirit is not the pursuit of the Spirit. It's like the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, and we could go down the list. Those are the results of the Spirit working in your life. They're not things that you pursue or work on. They're the fruit of that, right? And so
I get,
if we're talking about a church, does that church bear good fruit? Well, how many of the people who attend that church actually live a life that is a faithful Christian life? And I would say that when you have a significant percentage of your congregation that is in favor of something like abortion, or in favor of something like the whole rainbow coalition, the LGBTQ whatever thing, that you've got a problem, because it shows that they're walking away from God.
I think that the way that it is presently discussed certainly does. I think that
Certainly
it
does
is
what?
not a
I
topic.
don't.
The topic of abortion, the topic of LGBTQ plus in the church is discussed in the horribly demonic, horribly uh, inappropriate manner. But I don't actually think that the mechanics and the science, the reality of the topic, is what is discussed.
Well,
I
it
think
doesn't
there.
matter. It's a question of do these things bear good fruit in your life? No, they're traumatic and they damage people. They're evil.
They can, but
No, they
it
do.
does.
They do. There's no can. There's no question. These things 100% of the time they damage people.
I disagree only because the way that it is stated now, it does not matter what they're taking out, even if it is not something you and I would classify as a human baby. Literally, if it's a mass of cells, if it's a cancer, literally, they call it an abortion. So the
That's not
words they
true.
use, I promise you,
No, it's not.
they've
It's not
muddied the
true.
waters. They've
I
muddied the
disagree.
waters.
That's not
So
what that's not what that is not what goes on.
the idea of killing a healthy baby, I'm going to call it a baby because that's
Yeah,
what I feel
that's
like it
what it
is.
is.
The idea of killing a healthy baby is not something that most people feel like they're arguing for.
I don't agree. I think that when you look at what people think they're arguing for, that is exactly it.
No one that I know. I certainly have the conversation often enough around family and friends, and for those people that have a stomach to allow it at all, what they have in mind is not the voluntary murder of a healthy child in a belly. They do not have that in their brain.
I find that when I talk to people, and back during my college days, I did a whole bunch of talking about this stuff. That when I talked to people, that was exactly what they had in their mind. That a lot of times they couldn't bring themselves to state it plainly because there's something about it that is obviously evil and wrong. So they have to use euphemism, but that murdering a healthy baby is exactly what they had in mind.
And generally speaking, the perception that most people that I associate with is that I don't have to, just in like broad terms, I being anybody, don't have to sacrifice my life for another. So I don't have to jump in front of a bus to save somebody, right? That's the concept. So in a situation where it's one death or another, it's a choice of death, right? That's the concept that most people have in their mind. Nobody considers the voluntary death of a healthy person. Not in reality. When you do have those people that say, "I don't care," let's just, sacrifice the unhealthy, sacrifice the unfit. Those people look very bad very quickly.
Well, and I don't agree with you here. I think that that's exactly what they're doing, and that that's exactly what they say, and that there are a number of, that many people try to justify it to themselves some other way, but that they're not being honest with themselves or something, because what they're advocating is the murder of healthy human being.
Right, but it would require a nomenclature differentiation. You got to call it something else, and they will not, so that they can hide. Right, for those people that do want to make makeup, goodness knows what they're doing with the bodies. They've done terrible things in the past.
Yeah. We are basically a little past break time here. You want to just take a quick break and we'll come back?
Yep, let's do a quick break.
All right, be back in a minute.
Be back in a minute.
Modern Apocrypha is brought to you by the Energemetra 6 universe and by the upcoming book Bright Star by me, Jared Michaud. If you're interested in reading the book, head over to e6universe.com. I'm still looking for people for the book launch team. In return for posting a few reviews on bookstore sites and sharing on your own social media, you can get a free physical copy of the book and read it that way. Or if you'd like, we do have a few copies for sale for pre-sale between now and April of 2024 when the book comes out. Modern Apocrypha is made possible by North Arrow Coffee. It's the pro-life coffee company where 15% of every sale goes to a pro-life cause. And it's so good that even us non-coffee drinkers love the company. Everybody I know who I have given North Arrow Coffee to who is a coffee drinker loves it. So the quality of the product is wonderful, and they're not a company that hates you. So if you're interested, head over to northarrowcoffee.co and use the promo code E6 for 10% off with your order. And we're back.
Welcome back, everyone.
So, you were saying you think that our only real disagreement here is...
Oh, yeah, just talking about the abortion topic in general, or
Yeah.
really all topics as we're going through Catholicism or any of the broad religions and sloganizing, is the idea that the enemy commandeering words and holding for or against a word becomes a slogan, and denying 100% of any word will hurt somebody. There's no 100.
And I guess what I would say is that for anyone whose goal is understanding, they'll end up where you and I are. We may argue about things, but really, when it comes down to it, we're brothers. We both follow Christ. And so if we have a disagreement that's really serious, maybe it would make us part ways. That we saw that in the apostles in the Bible at a particular time. But that would be a pretty extreme thing. That would be a difficult place to reach, where most of the time, if our goal is understanding, we'll come to a place where we go, I understand that what you mean, that you, Greg, mean that healthy babies should not be killed, and that your problem is with the way these words are being used. I get that. And you know that I understand the same thing. You think that I'm trying to be too dogmatic in my use of a word, maybe, but I would say my experience as far as that goes is that the enemy tends to commandeer words and people just let it happen instead of saying, no, this isn't right. This is not the way this word is used. And if we let it be used that way, then we're giving the enemy ground. And, you know, if people want to be hurt by something, they're going to find something to be hurt by. But if they want to understand that you and I are both in favor of not murdering people, not killing people, we want people to be happy and healthy, then, you know, if people want to understand that, then we'll come to an agreement. And if they don't, well, they'll find a way to disagree with us. One other point before we move on that I just sort of want to reiterate here is that even if you have people who misunderstand a word, who are misusing a word, who are attending a particular church, that's a sign that the enemy is being successful in that church and that there's bad fruit there. The idea being, if what we're looking at is a fairly simple way to tell whether an organization is producing good or bad fruit, then one of the ways that you can see that they're producing bad fruit is that the words that they're using are not being used in as truthful as possible a manner.
Through intentional means, not just through ignorance.
Well, and at some level, even ignorance is a bad fruit because the Spirit will correct us when we go wrong in a serious way out of ignorance. He corrects those he loves. He chastens those he calls sons.
I've heard it brought up and commented on that the pure abolishment, that's the word, the pure abolishment of a topic may be unscriptural, like prohibition. It goes against drink light, don't drink heavy of wine. It doesn't say don't drink no wine, right? So in that concept, one of the best I've ever heard was actually a female Christian. She was speaking on stage, having a debate about abortion, and just got, flooded with the message that it's a difference in kind. It's a difference in kind, right? No one drink is going to kill someone. One abortion does kill someone. It's a difference in kind.
It's true. It's a difference in kind of thing. It's like saying, how much murder do we allow? Well, when you define murder as an attack upon someone's person, not a defense, because murder isn't defense. When you're defending yourself, that's a different thing. That isn't murder. When you define murder as an attack on someone's person, how much murder is okay?
Well, and you do get into the weeds about the definition of murder versus killing, because a death is not necessarily a murder.
That's why I brought up the whole defense versus offense thing, right?
Well, and is it defensive to do a preemptive strike on someone who's planning to attack you? That sort of thing comes around.
Well, and you'll always run into places on the margins where two topics meet where you could get into all sorts of discussions and get pulled off into the weeds. And that's why I wanted to bring up this whole you'll know them by their fruit thing in the first place, because there's something about human beings where it's easy to get us off into the weeds when you find those marginal issues. But when you ask the overall question, is their life overall bearing good fruit? Is their organization overall bearing good fruit? We're usually pretty good at making a judgment about that. It's one of the ways that Jordan Peterson has really pulled the discussion back onto the proper topic is by saying, you be honest with yourself and improve your own honesty and improve the way the words you're using and the actions you're taking so that you and your conscience are satisfied with them. Try doing that and see how that works out for you. And because we're not then talking about the intricacies of the subject in trying to lawyer it, instead we're just saying try living by your conscience and see how that impacts you. People actually start to get it some. But the other thing, and in the reverse, what that tells us is that our society has gotten to such a place of lawyering and rules and minutia that when you confront people with the notion of a conscience, it's a revolutionary thing, and that's a little sad.
Well, and it brings back into the idea of defense and offense. You can't be defensive in Christ. You've got to be proactive, proactive, proactive. If you're not moving towards the right goal, towards the goal, then all you're doing is dodging. All you're doing is not being the head that sticks up the most, the nail that sticks up the most. All you're doing is protecting what you perceive as your treasure, as opposed to working towards the goal that is set out for you. And so that does become a big deal, to aim for something as opposed to sit and then you're just dodging and dodging and dodging.
You and I both definitely agree on this, but I gotta say, the way you pulled that from one context to another sure confused me for a second.
I see. That's, yeah, certainly the image that came to my mind.
Oh, fair enough. But yeah, anyhow, so that to me, that's the crux of this thing, is that when I try to evaluate whether something is good or bad, I try not to judge other people any more than I can help, because, but for the grace of God, there go I. I can't think of a situation that I couldn't end up in, because I see the evil in my own heart way too clearly for that. But at the same time, I do have to make judgments about whether things are good or bad for me, right? It's like, do I eat this food? Do I go to this place? And the example that came into my head there, I'll just leave it. But the idea is, I have to make judgments about what's good and bad for my life, and usually the best way for me to do that is to look at the fruit that those things produce in other people.
It's an interesting place to go. Let me get your input on the topic of we both have a more complicated relationship with something like an online game circle, an online game portion of our life than our parents did.
Yeah.
And they might have looked at someone that played games as something separate from the way that we might look at something like that, as community building and not so frivolous, even, because it might have been something much more purely frivolous. The idea of community building and what you might see as a scam from Barnum and Bailey being a true place to decompress and find community that just wasn't the same in previous generations. Right? If you were off attending Barnum and Bailey, you may very well starve. You weren't taking care of the farm. There was something else that was giving up too much for that. And certainly people give up too much for their games now. You can always give up too much to any particular topic. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that digging in and delving into something like a frivolous activity that may be used for a non-frivolous end.
The best, what would I say? The best quote I've ever heard on this, I'm not going to remember where it came from. It came through Ravi Zacharias, but it came from a missionary who lived close to 150 years ago, somewhere in there, who asked his mom, and I'm sure somebody will let me know who this is from, because this is a fairly well-known story. But somebody asked his mom, how do I know if something is a sin or not? And her answer to him was something along the lines of, if it refreshes you and helps you to move towards your goal, then it's a valid leisure activity. If it if it drags you down into a pit, then you've gone from valid leisure activity into something sinful. And I find that when it comes to games, that's pretty much true of me. There have been times when I have been very, very active in online games, and I've spent as much time playing games as I have working. And sometimes that's been a bad thing, and other times it's actually not been a bad thing, because I was creating a community for people who needed a community. Who it was a source of life and light, and we had some of the most tight knit. I mean, just to give you some example, these are the people who have bought my book. My family didn't buy my book. My friends didn't buy my book. The people who bought the book were the people I played games with. And it's because we got to be such good friends and we care about each other that much. So it created a bond there that was really meaningful. But other times when I've played games and I've spent so much time at it, all I've done is drag myself down. And to some degree it depends on the game, to others it depends on the people, but I would say that distinction, if it refreshes you and moves you towards your goal, then it's a good thing, and if it drags you into a pit, then it's a bad thing, is a pretty good way to make that judgment.
Okay. I think that's a pretty good pin to put on it. Yeah, I can see every hobby, right? Whether it would be old-fashioned baseball cards, or oh gosh,
Sure.
what's the newfangled thing that people might collect these days? Um, but yeah, certainly just
How about writing? That's a hobby that I've seen go be either a very good thing or a very bad thing. Anything, as you said, anything.
anything can be.
And it's interesting. This is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I actually think it's really relevant here. One of the things that God put in place for us is this whole relationship with other people thing. It's really the core of everything that matters in the world in so many ways. We have to have a certain amount of food and water, but by and large, for most people, that isn't something that they fight with constantly, is having enough food and water. Instead, what we end up spending most of our time on as human beings is relationships with other people. And I have to think that that's by God's design, that that's what he intended.
It is certainly backed up through all of our mechanical parts and all of the bits and bobs that we're made of. Certainly provide that outcome.
Yeah.
We, what I'm speaking towards more specifically is that we are, oh gosh, how would you say, show fighters? If you look at an ape versus a lion versus an alligator, right? They'll each have a certain strength, and what primates, what we uh, as the grouping of five-fingered mammals on the planet do, is um, make loud noises, look bigger, right? We act, we build a perspective, build a narrative along every level, and we make everyone else believe it, and we believe it ourselves, and that's the path we're following.
Yeah, no, that's a good illustration. Interesting.
It is just top to bottom that we are actors of a sort.
We are. Well, and that acting is all about the relationship. It's all about the somehow how this comes across to other people, the relationship this gives us with other people. It's why celebrity works. It's why so many things in our world do act the way they act, is because people have such a draw toward relationship with others. Huh.
So back to the Catholic Church and why they are broad based at a negative spot. Certainly, on an organizational level, they have grown to a point where they have that. What did you call it? Uh, the separation of information, where they feel like you've got to get to a certain level to be revealed all of
Oh,
the information that they.
the Gnostic hierarchy characteristics.
Right, they certainly have what they consider to be hidden information that they don't spread around, where they hide information they believe to be true. Um, they hold to things that may not flow. The, I'm trying to. They try to codify things across areas that it may not necessarily be the appropriate fit in that area. Right? They want one codified Catholic Church across
Well,
the
and
entire world.
I don't. I'm using the Catholic Church as an example because it's so personally applicable to my life, but I wanted to generalize a little bit as well. I wanted to say that when it comes to other organizations, I can't think of an organization that is a religious organization in particular that doesn't go bad after a significant any significant length of time in existing. It's like it's almost as if we're not really supposed to have church organizations because that's a bad road to go down, because every time it happens it winds up bearing bad fruit.
So is the church organization ideally set up as a household organization?
This is a topic for a whole podcast all its own.
That's fair. That's fair. We'll have to bring that back around in another podcast
But
for sure.
my whole point in this, and where I wanted to go with this, you'll know them by their fruit, is just that we need to examine these things real carefully. We need to see whether it's good fruit or bad fruit. Is it bringing us closer to Christ, or is it pushing us away from him? And if it's bringing us closer, well, then that's something we ought to be engaging in. But there will come a point with each of these church organizations where it's the people who matter, and you engage with the organization because of the people around you. And if the organization gets to a particular level of bad, it's time to walk away from it. But it's
Well,
all about the people.
certainly we know that uh, the scripture I'm referring to, or that comes to mind, is to not put a stumbling block in front of your brother. Uh, and that stumbling block of a long lasting uh, hierarchy is going to force away. You're denying access to the Lord to someone. You need to provide a pathway for anyone to reach it, and it puts up walls that can and do prevent people from reaching Christ.
That's sure what I've seen. It's about time we call it here.
Yep, I think that's a good spot to stop it.
We'll see you next time, folks. Thank you.
Yep, we'll see you next time. Thank you.